A butter knife shouldn't kill, unless someone meant it to. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I'm your host, Harrington. This growing community is incredible. Comment where you're listening from. Let's get into it. When you live in a house where a man weighs 1/7 of a ton and won't budge for a hurricane, let alone a human being, you come to appreciate the fine art of breakfast. Eggs arrive exactly at 8:01. Toast is cut diagonally, not horizontally. Coffee is poured in silence unless your name is Nero, Wolfe, or Fritz Brenner. And under no circumstances does a butter knife ever draw blood. That Monday morning, I had just settled in with a boiled egg and a copy of the Gazette when the bell rang. The front door bell, not the kitchen buzzer, meaning this was someone off script. Fritz looked at me like I'd let the devil in through the drain pipe. Wolfe, of course, remained in his orchid room, unbothered by mortal trivialities like doorbells. I opened the door to find a woman whose coat cost more than my monthly wardrobe budget and whose eyes could slice through tempered glass. "Is this Mr. Wolfe's residence?" she asked, her voice crisp and dry like a fall leaf about to snap. She clutched her purse as if it had secrets it was afraid I'd steal. "You're standing on his doorstep," I said. "Name?" "Elspeth Charters." She paused. "Tell Mr. Wolfe it concerns a personal matter. Domestic." That last word was loaded, but I kept my eyebrows in check. I stepped aside and gestured her in. "Have a seat in the front room," I told her. "Mr. Wolfe doesn't usually take walk-ins, especially before beer o'clock, but I'll ask." She looked around the foyer like she expected to find surveillance devices in the wallpaper, then sat stiffly on the edge of the green armchair. I rapped once on the door to the plant rooms. Wolfe didn't answer. I rapped again. "A lady downstairs says it's a personal matter." Still nothing. "Domestic," I added. That did it. The door opened a crack. Wolfe's eyes narrowed from behind his yellow-tinted glasses. "Age?" "Mid-40s. Designer purse. Wound tighter than a banker's stopwatch." He sighed. 10 minutes. Then I returned to the Vandas. He shuffled out exactly 8 minutes later and entered the office like a ship gliding into harbor. Silent, enormous, and bearing a heavy cargo of disapproval. Miss Charters was waiting in the red chair, her legs crossed just so, her gloved fingers tapping against her purse. "I do not take divorce cases," Wolfe said before he'd even fully seated himself. "This is not a divorce case, Mr. Wolfe." He grunted, lowering himself with practiced agony into the custom-built chair that tolerated him better than most humans. She opened her purse, reached in, and laid it on the desk between them. A butter knife. The handle was polished silver. The blade was tarnished with something that wasn't butter. "I need you to tell me," she said, voice steady, "if that is what I think it is." Wolfe didn't blink. "Blood?" She nodded once. "And you brought it here," he said, "in your purse." "From where?" "My kitchen," she replied. "This morning." Wolfe looked at me. "Archie." "Already dialing," I said, reaching for the desk phone. "Not the police," she snapped. Wolfe raised a brow. "Madame, when cutlery is smeared with bodily fluids in private kitchens, that generally qualifies as a police matter." She lowered her voice. "It was at my husband's place. He lives 2 blocks away. We've been separated for 6 months. I paused with the receiver halfway up. Wolfe lifted a hand to stop me. She continued. "I went to feed his cat, as he's out of town. I still have a key. The housekeeper usually does it, but she called in sick. I walked into the kitchen and that," she gestured to the knife, "was lying in the sink. No dish, no food, no note. Just that." Wolfe tapped a finger against the desk. "Was your husband expecting anyone?" "No." "Is he prone to melodrama? Symbolic gestures?" Her lips curled. "Number, he's prone to anger and lawyers, but not performance art." "Then what precisely do you expect of me?" "I want to know," she said, "if something happened there. If someone is sending a message, or if something worse has occurred." Wolfe looked at the knife, then at her. "And she added, if I'm in danger. There was a pause. Wolfe reclined, closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Archie, he said, get Saul. I want someone at that house before noon. I looked at the knife again. For what it was worth, it didn't look fresh. But Wolfe didn't operate on looks. He operated on certainties, and when a butter knife shows up with what might be blood on it, and a rich woman says she's scared, he starts maneuvering like Napoleon at dawn. What about me? I asked. You, he said without opening his eyes, will begin with Miss Charters. Ask questions, tastefully, record the answers, then you will accompany her to her husband's house. With gloves. He opened one eye. And no breakfast interruptions tomorrow. I nodded. No knives either. I didn't mind skipping my second cup of coffee, but I drew the line at skipping the chance to poke around in a situation that had Nero Wolfe interested before noon. Miss Charters stood as I retrieved my hat and gloves. She was composed, but in the way a vase is composed, rigid, delicate, and likely to shatter if tipped just right. Your husband's name? I asked as we walked out into the stoop's light. Franklin Charters. He's in insurance, executive claims management at Hartley and Dawson, and this separation, friendly, hostile, or politely frigid. She slipped on her sunglasses like they were armor. Necessary. That gave me about as much warmth as a Manhattan sidewalk in February. I let it be. We took her car, a black Lincoln with spotless upholstery and the faint smell of lavender, which I suspected was less to soothe passengers and more to mask any hint of tension. She drove like someone trained to keep lines straight and intersections civilized. As we rolled into the block of East 73rd, I noted the row of brownstones, each vying to look more respectable than the last. Number 1480 was Franklin Charters' domain. 3 steps up, brass hardware polished to denial, and not a curtain out of place. She handed me the key at the door, hesitated, and then tucked her hands behind her back. You said the knife was in the sink? She nodded once. Then wait here. I stepped inside. The air had that stale hush a house gets when no one's lived in it for a few days. Just long enough for the walls to start wondering if they've been abandoned. The layout was predictable. Foyer, living room to the right, staircase curled along the left. Everything in symmetrical order. I made a beeline for the kitchen. The knife was still there, exactly as she said, a silver-handled butter knife resting alone in a white ceramic sink, its edge stained with a faint, rusty hue that could have been blood or berry jam. I used a gloved hand to pick it up and drop it into the plastic bag I'd brought. Next, I scanned the counters. No plates, no crumbs, no residue from breakfast or lunch. Fridge closed, dishwasher empty. The trash bin had been emptied, neatly, except for a lone crumpled paper towel that bore no visible stain. I checked the drawers, all present and accounted for. The rest of the cutlery rested in parallel formation like soldiers on leave. No sign of a scuffle, no broken glass, no ragged edge on the linoleum. I crouched, checked beneath the sink. Cleaning supplies. No blood drops, no signs of hasty cleanup. I returned to the foyer. All clear, I said. You sure nothing else was out of place? Yes. Her jaw tightened. I cleaned this kitchen 2 days ago. It wasn't there then. Anyone else with a key? Just Franklin and Mrs. Hatley, the housekeeper. She was home when you found it? Number She called me at 7 this morning saying she wasn't well, asked me to feed Mr. Muse. I blinked. Mr. Muse? The cat. Right. I nodded at the staircase. Mind if I take a look around upstairs? She hesitated, then nodded once. 2nd floor, bedroom, study, guest bath. The bedroom was made with military precision, bed corners tight, dresser gleaming, not a sock out of place. But something snagged my eye on the dresser, a tie. Navy blue with red flecks, tied in a perfect Windsor knot, lying flat. I checked the closet. Half empty. No suit jackets, no belts. 4 pairs of shoes neatly aligned. Study next. Now, here was something. The desk was locked, but Wolfe had seen to it I carried the tools of the trade. A small pry from a slender metal pick, and the center drawer yielded. Inside was a file folder. Labeled Elspeth, Custody Inquiry. I opened it. Letters, notes, a typed draft of what looked like a custody claim. Apparently, Franklin was preparing to fight for full custody of a child. Problem was, Elspeth hadn't mentioned any children. I put the file back exactly as I found it and shut the drawer. I didn't like surprises, and Wolfe hated them. I came back down. She was by the mantel now, touching a silver-framed photo. I didn't realize you had kids, I said casually. She turned. We don't, not together. The pause between the first and second sentence was telling. Stepchild. She inhaled sharply. Franklin's daughter from his first marriage. She lives upstate. We only saw her twice a year. And you were planning to change that? No. She looked out the window. She turned 18 last spring. The custody battle happened years ago. It's not relevant. I made a mental note the file upstairs had dates from last month. Before I could press further, her phone rang. She pulled it from her purse, checked the screen, and answered. Yes? What? Her face went pale. But he's not supposed to. She met my eyes. Franklin just landed at LaGuardia, early. Supposed to be away until when? Tomorrow night. I nodded. Mind if I'm here when you talk to him? She hesitated. He'll recognize you're not a friend. He's welcome to think I'm your new lawyer. She gave a tight smile. That might help. We didn't wait long. 26 minutes later, a silver BMW pulled up, parked with deliberate care, and Franklin Charters stepped out. He was tall, lean, and tan in the way executives get tan. Golf tan, tailored and practiced. His hair was silver at the temples and sharp at the part. He walked like he owned the pavement. He saw Elspeth and paused. His face went from neutral to formal, then sharpened when he saw me. Elspeth, he said. And who's this? I stepped forward. Archie Goodwin. Miss Charters asked me to look into something. I see, he said tightly. What are you doing in my house? I've been asking questions, I said. She found something odd this morning. His eyes narrowed. What? A butter knife. He blinked. Excuse me? In the sink. With a smear of something. Might be blood. Might be jelly. I haven't been here since Thursday. That would be surprising, I said, since your tie's on the dresser and your file drawer wasn't locked very well. His lips thinned. I added, also, there's a photo frame in the hall that looks recently moved. Dust lines fresh. Elspeth glanced at me. Franklin straightened. Are you suggesting someone's been here? I'm suggesting you have a very clean house and one very out-of-place object in the kitchen. I'm also suggesting your housekeeper didn't show up today, which makes the timing curious, but mostly I'm suggesting you tell us if you're in any kind of trouble. His gaze flicked to Elspeth, then back to me. I don't have to answer to either of you. No, I said. But if that's blood on the knife and you didn't put it there, someone did. And whoever it was had a reason. Maybe symbolic, maybe angry, maybe very literal. He crossed his arms. And you're saying I should hire Wolfe? I'm saying someone either wants to send you a message or is hoping you won't be around long enough to receive it. He stared at me. Then finally, he said, tell Wolfe I'll pay double his usual fee if he finds out who was in my house. I nodded. He'll care less about the money than about the butter knife. But I'll let him know. As we left, I looked back once. Franklin stood in the doorway, staring down at his own foyer like it had betrayed him. In Wolfe's world, disorder is the enemy. And today, a butter knife was enough to signal that order had been breached, which meant someone, somewhere, was about to find out just how sharp a mind like Wolfe's could be. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the rundown while he wrestled with a glass of beer and the unwelcome disruption of his afternoon. He listened with his eyes closed, his fingers steepled across his stomach like they were holding in something heavier than lunch. When I finished, he didn't speak right away. That was typical. When Wolfe pauses, it's not because he's stumped. It's because he's eliminating everything that isn't worth his voice. "Pfui," he said finally. "A butter knife, and an uninvited entry. Ridiculous." "Ridiculous, yes," I agreed. "But real. I saw the kitchen. There's something off. The knife's too neat, too specific. Like someone meant it to be found." And the husband. Franklin Charters. Type A to the bone. The kind of man who hires decorators to align picture frames. You'd like him. He's allergic to disorder. Wolfe grunted. He offered to pay double. "Yes, I told him you wouldn't care." "Correct." He reached for a small bell and rang once. Fritz appeared, as punctual as a metronome. "Bring me the knife," Wolfe said, "and a linen napkin." When Fritz returned, Wolfe took the bag I'd stored the knife in, laid the napkin on his desk blotter, and carefully tipped the utensil out. The blade's faint discoloration showed up clearly under the lamplight. "Berry preserves, or hemoglobin," Wolfe murmured. "The most ridiculous clues often yield the most troublesome complications." "Are we testing it?" "Yes. I'll have it taken to the lab, but not before we do something more useful." He glanced at me. "Get Saul." That was the second time in 2 days. Saul Panzer was our best freelance operative. Low profile, high efficiency, and about as nosy as a crow in a jewelry store. I picked up the phone and dialed Saul's number from memory. While we waited, Wolfe poured himself another inch of beer and frowned at the knife as if it had insulted his breeding. "Elspeth Charters," he said, "is lying. Not blatantly, subtly, she's concealing something essential. She brought us the knife. She brought us the story of the knife. The object, yes, but not the full context. Something in her demeanor, her choice of words. She's holding back. And Franklin Charters is reactive, not defensive. He expected an intrusion, even if he didn't anticipate this specific one. He told me he hadn't been home since Thursday, but there's a tie on his dresser folded like it just came off his neck, and a drawer that held a custody folder. Wolfe raised a brow. "Which he denied knowledge of?" "He didn't mention it. Elspeth said the custody matter was old history, but the paperwork's dated last month." Wolfe reclined deeper. "So one of them is preparing for war, while the other pretends it's peacetime." The bell rang again. This time it was Saul. Tall, calm, and with that quiet competence that makes you feel slightly less competent just standing next to him. "Got something odd?" he asked, stepping in. "Something domestic," I said, "which means it's already dangerous." Wolfe gestured toward the empty red chair. "Mr. Panzer, a brief assignment. Mr. and Mrs. Franklin Charters, recently separated. She visited his house today to feed the cat. Found a butter knife in the sink. Stained, possibly with blood. Brought it to me." Saul's eyebrows lifted a millimeter. Polite of her. "Indeed, there is no evidence of struggle. The house was clean, but not empty. Mr. Goodwin observed personal effects suggesting Franklin had returned home earlier than claimed. I want you to determine whether either of them has consulted with legal representation recently or if there has been unusual surveillance. Neighbors, attorneys, private investigators." "Understood," Saul said, already mentally plotting the map. "You want both sides followed?" "Number follow the question, not the person. If Elspeth is staging something, we need to know why. If Franklin is being stalked or threatened, we need the source." "I'll call you in the morning." With Saul gone, Wolfe turned back to the knife. "Someone wanted that found," I said again. "Yes, but not by the police. and not by the intended recipient. Elspeth. Precisely. So it was meant for Franklin. Perhaps, but Elspeth was the one who found it, and who interpreted it as a warning. I drummed my fingers. You think she planted it? I think she anticipated something, perhaps hoped for it, perhaps feared it, but I do not believe she was entirely surprised. That was Wolfe's way of saying we had a motive, even if we didn't know whose. The lab courier came around 5. I handed over the knife, signed the form, and left Wolfe to brood. At 6:30, I got a call. It was Saul. I spoke to a contact at Cormack and Delaney, he said. Big firm, high-end clientele. They've got a sealed custody case filed 2 weeks ago. Petitioner, Franklin Charters, and the respondent, Elspeth. But it's not about his daughter. It's for emergency guardianship of a minor, name redacted under sealed terms. I frowned. That makes no sense. They don't have kids. I know, Saul said, which means someone's hiding one. I hung up and walked straight into Wolfe's office. Custody case, I said. Sealed. Filed by Franklin. Against Elspeth. Not over his daughter. Some new kid. Wolfe sat up straighter. Then Elspeth is concealing a dependent. Possibly one she isn't legally entitled to keep. Franklin wants control, so he starts a legal proceeding. She panics. Then a butter knife shows up in his sink. Wolfe nodded slowly. Suggestive. The knife isn't a threat. It's a signal. Of what, I'm not yet sure. And if it's blood, then it was meant to suggest a child is in danger. I exhaled. You think she's using the kid as leverage? I think we are being shown parts of a puzzle designed to provoke a particular reaction. We must resist. Just then, the phone rang again. This time it was Inspector Kramer. Wolfe, he barked, you work in the Charters case. That depends, Wolfe said. What have you found? Body, small boy, riverbank, looks to be around 7. Identified from a note found in the pocket. Mikey. Wolfe's face went very still. Kramer added, we're pulling prints. But the name matches a missing child report filed by a Mrs. Elspeth Charters 2 days ago. I stared at Wolfe. She never mentioned it, I said. No, Wolfe murmured. She didn't. Kramer barked again. If she's sitting in your office, don't let her leave. She isn't, Wolfe replied calmly. But she will be, shortly. He hung up. I stood. What now? We find out who Mikey was, and whether his death was a warning or a punishment. Wolfe closed his eyes again. When the truth is dangerous, he said softly. People lie. When it becomes unbearable, they try to make others believe it instead. And I knew right then, this case wasn't just about blood on a knife. It was about guilt, guardianship, and a truth someone had tried very hard to bury until the river refused to keep the secret. I left Wolfe's office with the sound of Kramer's voice still rattling in my ear, and Wolfe's last words following me like a slow shadow down the hallway. Someone had lied about a child. Someone had tried to frame that lie with just enough truth to make it stick. And now, a boy's body, 7 years old, named Mikey, had been pulled from the river. Elspeth Charters had filed a missing person report 2 days ago, but not once during her calm, measured performance in Wolfe's office had she mentioned a missing child. Not one word, no tremor in her voice, no mother's panic, just a butter knife in a purse and a vague whiff of danger. I made a beeline to my desk and started dialing. First, the 19th precinct. I asked for the report on the Mikey Charters case. The desk sergeant was tight-lipped, but I pulled a few strings and reminded him I was attached to Wolfe, who happened to be Kramer's personal thorn, and that loosened things just enough to give me a few crumbs. The missing person report had been filed by Elspeth Charters. She'd claimed the boy had wandered out of a playgroup at Riverside Park. Unusual behavior, prone to sudden fear responses, the form noted. No biological parent listed, just Elspeth's name and an attached letter of guardianship. Self-printed, not notarized. I hung up and headed back to Wolfe. He hadn't moved. His eyes were closed again, but I could tell by the tension in his hands that he was digesting more than beer. "She filed the missing person report," I said. "2 days ago. Claimed the boy wandered off in the park. No legal documents, just a typed letter saying she was guardian." "That was an attempt," Wolfe said slowly, "to create a trail. Of concern, of proximity, of innocence. She wanted to establish that she was not only present but responsible, and therefore wounded. Except she never mentioned him to us. Because we are not the police. We are deduction. We peel back curtains." "And she didn't want the curtain peeled?" "Not yet." Wolfe opened his eyes and stared at the far wall, as if it had betrayed him too. "Elspeth Charters is concealing 3 things," he said. "The nature of her relationship to the boy's origin, and the boy's fate. 2 may be lies, 1 may be truth." Just then the phone rang again. It was Saul. "I've got something," he said. The name Mikey came up in a sealed juvenile record. I had to dig sideways through a caseworker I know. The child's full name was Michael Aaron Whitt. Entered foster care 2 years ago, 5 homes in 13 months. Then, 6 months ago, placed in private guardianship under a court emergency provision. The guardian was Elspeth Charters. I blinked. So she wasn't lying. Not completely. "No," Saul said, "but she didn't go through a full adoption. This was a quiet placement, no publicity, no long-term oversight. Just signatures." "Did Franklin know?" "Not officially. His name was never attached. But 3 months ago, he had a sealed meeting with a lawyer from a family law firm that handles contested guardianships." I thanked him and hung up. Wolfe already knew what I was going to say. He always does. "She had legal custody," I said. "Quietly arranged, and Franklin was trying to undo it." "Possibly," Wolfe murmured. "Or possibly he was trying to protect the child." I froze. "You think he knew something?" "I think Franklin Charters is many things. A structured man, a prideful man, a controlling man, but I do not believe he is capable of harming a child." "And Elspeth?" Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "She came to me with a knife, not with grief." It was just past 8 when the doorbell rang again. Fritz opened it. It was Kramer. He stormed into the office with all the subtlety of a hailstorm and dropped a folded manila folder on Wolfe's desk. "The autopsy isn't final," he said, "but preliminary says the kid drowned. No signs of blunt trauma, no internal bleeding, no defensive wounds, but there was a sedative in his blood." "What type?" Wolfe asked. "Phenobarbital. Not enough to kill him, but enough to slow him down." He looked at both of us hard. Whoever gave it to him didn't want to hurt him. They wanted to keep him calm, controlled, and then lost control, Wolfe said quietly. Kramer grunted. "You still want to say this isn't a murder?" "I said," Wolfe replied, "that we did not yet have sufficient data to assign intent. That remains true. The sedative suggests a plan. The river suggests panic. I've got officers at both Charters' homes, but if you've got anything else—" "I will," Wolfe said. "Soon." Kramer left, looking like he'd swallowed his badge. As soon as the door clicked shut, Wolfe reached for the phone. He dialed. "Mr. Panzer, I want a visitor located immediately. Name, Joanna Miles. That's Myles. She lived with Elspeth Charters 3 years ago. Possibly a roommate, possibly more. You'll find the connection in Elspeth's old address records. I want to know where she is, if she's working, and if she ever filed for foster certification." He hung up and turned to me. "Elspeth did not become a guardian by accident. She learned how, and someone taught her. You think Joanna's involved? I think, Wolfe said, that Mikey was not just a child. He was an asset, something Elspeth took to bind herself to Franklin, to complete a picture she was painting. And when that started to fall apart, she couldn't let him go. There was a long silence in the room. Wolfe picked up the linen napkin that had held the knife and folded it neatly. "Tomorrow," he said, "we invite them all." "All of them?" "Yes, Elspeth, Franklin, the housekeeper, and if Saul finds her, Joanna." He looked at me. "I want the full gallery in place. This case has no more room for concealment." "And what if one of them doesn't show?" "They will," Wolfe said calmly, "because for at least one of them, the performance is not over." He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes once more, as if he'd just given the cue that would bring down the final curtain. And I knew that the real interrogation, Wolfe's kind, the kind that cuts deeper than any knife, was about to begin. The following morning started with silence, the kind Wolfe cherished and I had come to dread. Silence meant waiting, and waiting meant thinking, and thinking, when the subject was a drowned child and a butter knife with no fingerprints, wasn't particularly restful. Fritz brought coffee. Wolfe ignored it. He sat in his chair with his eyes half closed, hands resting on the chair's arms like a judge readying a verdict. By 10, Saul had called. Joanna Miles was found, working as a night clerk at a private medical office in the East 60s. She had previously applied for foster certification 2 years ago, but had never completed the full process. Instead, she moved in with Elspeth Charters for a 6-month period that aligned neatly enough with the time Mikey Witt was placed into Elspeth's custody. Neighbors at the old address remember them as close, Saul had said over the line. Some say they were raising the boy together. Then Joanna disappeared, quietly. No incident, no police, just gone. I relayed the findings to Wolfe, who simply nodded once. "They'll all come today," he said. "You really think Franklin will sit through this?" "He's a man who needs control, and nothing unsettles him more than the idea someone else has the narrative. He'll come. And Elspeth? She'll come because she still thinks she can outplay us." That afternoon, the chairs in the office filled one by one. Joanna Miles arrived first, nervous, eyes downcast, a small woman with the tired hands of someone used to clocking in when the city sleeps. Then Franklin, buttoned up as always, his jaw tight and his glance bouncing off every object like he was cataloguing the room for weaknesses. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hatley, entered next, stiff-backed and stoic. With a tremor in her left hand she tried hard to hide. And finally, Elspeth, last to arrive, first to speak. "This feels theatrical," she said as she took the red chair. "You've gathered us like suspects in a parlor mystery." Wolfe opened his eyes and stared at her. "Madame, it is theatrical, but you misunderstand the role you are playing. You are not the playwright." She blinked, caught off guard. Wolfe shifted in his chair. "We will proceed with method. Mr. Goodwin, begin with the events of Monday." I gave the room the brief version. Elspeth's visit to Wolfe, the butter knife in the sink, the trip to the house, the oddities upstairs. I avoided flair. This wasn't the moment for one-liners. Franklin interrupted only once. "I still don't know how you got into my desk drawer." "You left a tie knotted on your dresser," I replied. I figured it was an invitation. He huffed, but didn't deny it. Wolfe nodded. "Thank you, Archie. Now, Mr. Charters, you filed for emergency custody." "Why?" Franklin looked at Elspeth, then at Joanna, then finally back to Wolfe. "I found out," he said slowly, "that a child had been placed under my wife's care without any formal adoption, oversight, or documentation beyond a temporary guardianship order. When I tried to get details, I was met with vague answers. I had questions, legal ones, safety ones. You suspected harm? I suspected obsession, he said. She was different with him. She wanted to be something. She kept saying she'd been given him, like it was fate, not a responsibility. Wolfe tilted his head. And you, Miss Miles? Joanna looked up for the first time. Her voice was quiet, rasped at the edges. I helped Elspeth foster Mikey. I'd started the application process, but didn't qualify. She did. So we used her name. I was around at first. Then I wasn't. Why? Elspeth changed. She was intense, possessive. Mikey got anxious around her. He cried at night. He wanted to leave. Did you notify the agency? No, Joanna whispered. I just left. Wolfe breathed in deeply. Mrs. Hatley, you've worked for Mr. Charters for how long? 6 years. Were you present when Mikey visited? Yes. Miss Charters would bring him sometimes. She never left him with me alone. Did the child seem frightened? A pause. Then, yes. Wolfe nodded once, as if filing the final piece of a pattern into place. Mrs. Charters, he said, voice clipped, you filed a missing person report for Mikey 2 days ago. Why? Her chin rose a fraction. Because he was missing. But you did not mention it to me the morning you came here. I was in shock. No, Wolfe said sharply. You were composed, calculated. You presented a staged prop and a curated tone. He leaned forward. The truth, madam. Elspeth said nothing. Wolfe continued. You brought Mikey into your life to serve as a foundation, a wedge, a thing to build your identity around. But it did not work. Franklin rejected the fantasy. Joanna fled it, and Mikey... He stopped. Mikey resisted it. Elspeth's hands tightened in her lap. He was mine. No one else wanted him. Incorrect, Wolfe said coldly. What no one wanted was your narrative, the version of motherhood and martyrdom you wrapped around yourself like gauze. When Mikey failed to play the role you assigned him, you panicked. I didn't hurt him. No, Wolfe agreed. I believe you gave him something to make him sleep, to keep him docile, but sedatives in children are unpredictable. You took him to the park, hoping to calm him, perhaps even intending to return him to the agency, but then he collapsed. Maybe he stopped breathing. Maybe he went still. You thought he was dead. Joanna gasped. You didn't check. You couldn't bear to. You simply left him by the river and fled. Hours later, realizing what you had done, you filed the report. The knife came after. That was your message to Franklin, a warning or a punishment. The room was very still. Finally, Elspeth whispered, he wasn't supposed to die. And that, Wolfe said, is what every person says when their delusions cost a life. Kramer stepped out from the side door. He'd arrived 20 minutes earlier, silently, and stood in the back of the office during the whole thing. Elspeth Charters, he said flatly, you're under arrest for criminal negligence and obstruction of justice. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just folded in on herself like paper. As she was led out, Wolfe finally let his breath release. Franklin sat rigid, staring at the floor. Joanna wept quietly in the corner. Mrs. Hatley crossed herself and rose to leave. Outside, the city moved on. Inside the brownstone, Wolfe reached for his beer. Dinner, he muttered, must not be delayed for tragedy. I looked at him, waited. He didn't offer a philosophy this time, just took a sip and stared at the orchids. Archie, he said, butter knives are not meant to draw blood. No, I replied, but sometimes they tell the whole story anyway. That evening, the brownstone felt unusually quiet, even for Wolfe's standards. No phone rang, no footsteps echoed from the kitchen. Even Fritz moved with a kind of respectful hush, like a museum caretaker afraid to breathe too loud near a priceless canvas. Wolfe had returned to his orchids the moment Kramer and Elspeth left. disappearing into the greenhouse with no more than a muttered word about humidity levels. I let him go. He'd earned his solitude. But I hadn't. I stayed in the office, the same red chair still warm from the afternoon's performance. There were questions still unsettled, and they curled in my gut like smoke. Elspeth Charters had given us just enough truth to get close, then swerved. Wolfe's deduction was solid, airtight even, but something hadn't clicked cleanly into place. The autopsy hadn't returned yet. And I'd seen enough crime scenes, enough clumsy lies and real tears, to know when something didn't line up. So I started with what Wolfe would call nuisance variables. I rang up the lab. The coroner hadn't finalized the report yet, but he was kind enough, reluctantly, to tell me one more detail. The water in Mikey's lungs was consistent with post-mortem submersion. He was dead before he hit the river. Now that changed things. I got up, paced the office once, and went for the landline. I dialed Saul. He answered on the second ring. "Do me a favor," I said. "Check Elspeth's apartment, full sweep, anything off. And fast." He didn't ask why. Saul never needed the why. He just said, 10 minutes, and hung up. I went to the kitchen next. Fritz was peeling carrots with the precision of a man who considered vegetables minor works of art. "Fritz," I said, "did Elspeth Charters eat or drink anything while she was here?" Number, she declined coffee. "Water, too." "And the knife? You touched it?" "With gloves." "Where did you put it after Wolfe examined it?" "In the bag, back on your desk." It was still there. I looked at the handle again. No smudges, no prints. Still too clean. Wolfe returned at exactly 7:10. He entered without a word, lowered himself into his chair, and regarded me like I was already about to annoy him. "You're thinking," he said. "Trying." Unusual. "I just got off the phone with the coroner. Mikey was dead before he hit the water." Wolfe's eyelid twitched. "That wasn't part of your deduction," I added. "Number, but it explains the sedative." "If she panicked," I said, "she didn't panic because he collapsed. She panicked because she found him dead." Wolfe reached for the bell and rang it. Fritz entered with the beer tray. "Call Saul again," Wolfe said. "He's already out," I replied. "I sent him to Elspeth's place." Wolfe nodded. "Good." 10 minutes passed. Then the phone rang. Saul's voice was low, urgent. "Found something." "Go on." "Apartment's clean. Too clean. All the boys' belongings are gone. No clothes, no toothbrush, no drawings, nothing except one thing." "What?" "Trash bin in the kitchen, tightly packed, but under the bag, wedged into the metal, tiny spots, pinkish red, almost dried. Not blood exactly, but you know that cloudy color when milk and blood mix? Yeah. I think something happened in that kitchen." I hung up. Wolfe waited. I relayed it to him without dressing it up. His fingers drummed once, twice. Then he closed his eyes. "Elspeth didn't kill the boy." "No." "No," Wolfe said softly. "She covered for someone who did." The words landed with weight. I felt it immediately. "Joanna?" "No," he said. "Joanna fled because she feared Elspeth. If she had committed the act, she would have disappeared completely. She would not weep in my office." "Then who?" Wolfe looked at me, and there was a spark of something in his eye. Disgust, maybe, or reluctant pity. "Mrs. Hatley." I blinked. "The housekeeper?" "Precisely." He leaned forward. "Think, Archie. She said she never stayed alone with Mikey. Why mention that at all unless it had been questioned before? She also said he was afraid. Not quiet, not anxious. Afraid. Yet she never reported anything. She crossed herself when she left, and she trembled. Guilt. Or the memory of what she did. But why would Elspeth cover for her? Wolfe looked at the ceiling. Because when your entire identity is built around nurturing something fragile, the thought that someone you trusted, someone you allowed near that child, took that away from you, destroys the foundation. So you pretend they didn't. You absorb the guilt yourself. You turn it into a narrative of mistake instead of malice. There was a silence between us. Then Wolfe said, "Call Kramer." I picked up the phone again. This time, it took longer. Kramer was at the precinct, elbows deep in paperwork. When I got him on the line and told him Wolfe wanted him back, I could almost hear the suspicion crackling like static. "What now?" he growled. Wolfe didn't even get up. He gave me a single sentence. "Tell him to bring a search team to the Charter's residence. Focus on the kitchen floorboards and the drains." That was all. Kramer showed up an hour later, grim as ever. By then, the first official crime scene team had already swept through the kitchen on Wolfe's orders. What they found beneath the tiles, traces of hemoglobin and soap residue, was enough to reclassify the entire case. More telling, though, was what they found in the secondary trash chute, a small stained child shirt tucked into a zip bag. Elspeth hadn't panicked because Mikey had wandered off. She panicked because she found him already dead, and then, like Wolfe said, she folded the guilt into herself rather than blame the only person who might have harmed him and still remained in her inner circle. Mrs. Hatley was arrested without resistance. In the interrogation that followed, she said almost nothing except that she'd been angry. Mikey had knocked over a vase. She'd grabbed his arm. He'd fallen. His head had struck the corner of the cabinet. "I thought he'd be fine," she said. But then he started breathing funny. And then he stopped. She panicked, called no one. Elspeth came home hours later, found what had happened, and refused to let the truth come out. Instead, she staged the disappearance. She kept the butter knife. She needed something symbolic, something she could control. That's how guilt behaves when it's trying to erase something that can't be undone. Later that night, Wolfe and I sat in silence. He sipped his beer. I flipped through the day's notes. Finally, I said, "You were right." He grunted. "Naturally. But why the butter knife? She could have chosen anything." Wolfe set his glass down and folded his hands. She wanted to leave a symbol that could not be mistaken for a weapon. She was mourning, not threatening. It was the closest thing she had to an apology. To who? To the boy. To Franklin. To herself. We sat there for a while longer. Then Wolfe said, almost to himself, "Some truths are unbearable, and so they are dressed as lies, until someone dares to undress them." I leaned back and let that hang in the air. He was right. Again. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray, washed-out sky that feels like an apology. Too late to matter, too mild to change anything. Fritz served breakfast, but Wolfe barely acknowledged it. He had retreated into his morning routine like a wounded general inspecting his war maps after a campaign that left no victors. The Charter's case had ended not with a triumph, but with a quiet collapse. Truth surfacing not by confession, but by pressure and erosion. I sipped my coffee and waited for Wolfe to open the paper. He didn't. When the phone finally rang, it was Saul. He didn't waste time on greetings. "There's something you should see," he said. "Joanna Miles came by the precinct this morning, not for questioning. She brought a letter, left it with a detective on night duty. It's addressed to Wolfe." I blinked. "A letter?" She didn't wait, just dropped it off and walked out. 20 minutes later, I was standing in the brownstone's front room, a heavy cream envelope in hand. The handwriting on the front was tight and angular. Wolfe sat with his hands folded, watching me as I opened it. I read it aloud. "Mr. Wolfe, you don't know me. Not really. But I've followed what you do. People speak of you in half-finished thoughts, like you're some kind of storm, but you're not. You're a mirror. You were right about Elspeth. She didn't hurt Mikey. But she did something else. She erased the warning signs. She needed to believe she could save something broken, and that belief blinded her. But there's one thing you didn't know. Mrs. Hatley didn't mean to kill him, but she wasn't the first to harm him. There were bruises on his back weeks before. I saw them. I told Elspeth. She said it was adjustment. She always said that, and when I pushed harder, she pushed me out. So I left. I ran from the weight of what I couldn't fix. But I think about him every day. He liked strawberries. He used to line them up before eating them, always in odd numbers. I never asked why. Maybe I should have. Tell the truth, Mr. Wolfe. Tell it even if it won't change anything. Because people deserve to know that silence didn't protect him. Joanna. When I finished, the room stayed quiet. Wolfe didn't move. He didn't reach for his beer. He just sat there, eyes shut, lips pressed so tightly they looked like a single unbroken line. She tried, I said finally. Wolfe opened his eyes. She tried, but not enough. She left, I said. But she didn't forget. No, he said. But remembrance is not redemption. I tucked the letter back into the envelope. What do we do with it? Nothing, Wolfe said. We've done our work. Let the police do theirs. He stood, slowly, like the weight of the story had settled into his knees, and walked to the window. The orchids caught the morning light just barely, and he stared at them for a while as if inspecting them for guilt. But the case wasn't finished with us yet. Around noon, Kramer called. Wolfe, he said, sounding tired enough to fall asleep mid-sentence. We re-interviewed Elspeth after Joanna's note surfaced. She cracked, said she'd seen bruises weeks before the boy's death, blamed herself for not acting, but the real twist is this. Mrs. Hatley wasn't the only one who had contact with the boy that day. Wolfe sat back down. I hovered. Who else? Kramer snorted. Franklin. I blinked. Franklin? He told us he hadn't seen the boy for weeks. Yeah, well, turns out he stopped by the apartment that morning. A neighbor spotted him. Security camera confirmed it. Said he was there for maybe 10 minutes. No record of it from anyone. Why lie? I asked. That's the thing. He says he was there to talk to Elspeth about returning custody. Claims Mikey was asleep the whole time. But the timeline's tight. Too tight. You think he was involved? I think he knew more than he told us. And now we're digging. When I hung up, Wolfe was staring at the ceiling again, as if it held the rest of the puzzle. We assume the sedative was accidental, he said. But what if it wasn't? You think Franklin gave it to him? Number. But Franklin may have brought something. Food, drink. Something tainted. I nodded slowly. Strawberries. Wolfe looked at me. He liked them, I said. Joanna mentioned it in her letter, always arranged in odd numbers. Wolfe's mind began to tick. I could see it. His fingers tapped once against the arm of the chair. Check the trash inventory, he said. See if any produce was listed. Specifically strawberries. If Franklin brought something as a gesture, something Elspeth fed Mikey without knowing, it could explain a stronger dose. Accidental overdose? Or deliberate miscalculation? I made the call. The evidence tech on the line confirmed it. A strawberry carton had been found in the kitchen bin, cleaned, no fingerprints, but the packaging was from a boutique grocer on 82nd. The kind of place that hand-labels everything. If Franklin had brought them, there'd be a receipt. Saul was back on it before I could say go. That evening, he returned with the receipt. Franklin Charters. 1 day before the boy's death. Strawberries? Premium batch. Paid in cash. But the clerk remembered him. Tall, silver hair, red tie. The same tie I saw laid out on the dresser. We had the last link. Elspeth didn't kill Mikey. Neither did Mrs. Hatley. Not alone. Franklin Charters, in his own polished, restrained way, had contributed to the boy's death. Perhaps not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. He wanted the boy gone. wanted the problem solved. Maybe he thought a heavy sleep would make Mikey miss a day of school, make the state question Elspeth's fitness, but he miscalculated, gave too much, or gave it in the wrong way, and when Mikey stopped breathing, no one knew who to blame. So everyone blamed themselves. The next morning, Franklin was arrested. Not for murder. There wasn't enough. But for tampering with a miner's welfare, for concealing evidence, for obstructing a police investigation. He didn't fight it. Just looked at the ground and said, "I didn't mean to hurt him." Wolfe didn't gloat. He never does. Not in cases like this. That night I found him in the plant room, fingers brushing along a pale white orchid that had just bloomed. He liked strawberries, I said again. Wolfe didn't turn. There is a cruelty in innocence, Archie, not because it is malicious, but because it trusts. He looked at me over his shoulder. When the world proves it wrong, the damage is irreparable. And that, I thought, was the whole truth. Not the one Elspeth told, not the one Franklin dodged, not even the one Kramer boxed up in files and charges, but the kind that lingers, quiet, bitter, and irreversible, like the taste of something too sweet, just before it kills. It was the third day after the truth had begun to rot its way out of the Charters case, and Wolfe still hadn't touched his morning beer. That, in itself, was more of a headline than anything in the papers. The Gazette had run a small story on page 6, prominent insurance exec linked to child welfare scandal. But the wording was cautious, as if the typewriter itself didn't want to offend the wrong people. No murder charges, no mugshot, just quiet disgrace, wrapped in terms like inquiry pending and court proceedings expected. I knew better. Wolfe knew better. And somewhere in a concrete holding cell in Manhattan, Franklin Charters probably knew it best of all. He hadn't meant to kill the boy, but he had meant to remove him, whether by legal maneuver, misdirection, or pharmaceutical encouragement, and the line between those things had proved thinner than he thought. Still, there was one piece left that gnawed at me. And Wolfe hadn't spoken of it once. Around noon, I finally asked him, "Why the strawberries?" I said. He looked up from his orchids, his fingers coated with the faint chalk of pollen. "You said it yourself," he replied. The boy liked them. "I know, but that's just it. They were a comfort, a routine. Why would Franklin use that?" "To mask the bitterness." "You think he planned it that far ahead?" "I think," Wolfe said, "he saw an opportunity. He wanted Mikey sedated, not dead. But even that desire, the wish for silence, for control, was enough to justify a risk, and the boy trusted the strawberries." He set down the cloth he'd been using. It is always the things we love that betray us most effectively. That line sat heavy in the room for a while. Then Wolfe turned back to the orchids. But I wasn't finished. That afternoon, I visited Joanna. She lived in a walk-up on the edge of Midtown, above a dry cleaner, next to a place that still sold VHS tapes out of habit. The hallway smelled like old paper and boiled rice. She answered the door with red eyes and a cardigan that hung off one shoulder like it had given up trying. "I figured you might come," she said. I stepped inside. The apartment was small, just a kitchenette, a love seat, and one shelf of books lined with picture frames turned face down. "I'm not here for statements," I said. "Just closure." She nodded and sat on the edge of a mismatched armchair. I took the stool by the sink. "You were right," I told her. "About the bruises. About the fear." "I wasn't brave enough," she said. "I told Elspeth. I thought that was enough." It was more than most would have done. "No," she said. "It was a whisper. He needed thunder." I didn't argue. She was entitled to her guilt. We all were. "I keep seeing his hands," she said softly, lining up strawberries, counting under his breath. "He trusted the pattern," I said. She nodded. Then, did Elspeth say anything? She confessed, not to hurting him directly, but to hiding the harm and to loving her image of him more than the boy himself. Joanna swallowed. That sounds like her. I think, I added, she wanted to be something better, but when the child she got wasn't the child she'd imagined, she couldn't adjust. She tried to reshape him instead. I wanted to be his home, Joanna whispered. But I didn't qualify. Not enough money, not enough space. So she stepped in. I thought maybe love would fill the gaps. It didn't. Number love's only the start, not the structure. I stood. Wolfe won't tell the world what happened. That's not how he works, but I will. She looked at me. Why? Because someone should remember the child, not just the case. She didn't stop me when I left. That night, Wolfe was already in the dining room when I returned. Fritz served roast duck. Wolfe barely touched it. I poured myself a drink and sat across from him. You told me once that the most disturbing crimes weren't born of greed, I said, but of vanity. Wolfe didn't lift his eyes. Elspeth wanted to be seen as a savior, I continued. Franklin wanted to be seen as competent. Neither saw the boy clearly. No, Wolfe said quietly. But he saw them. Mikey. He did not ask to be protected. He simply existed. And in that quiet, persistent presence, he became inconvenient to everyone with an agenda. He never had a chance, I said. Wolfe finally looked up. Few do. The meal ended without dessert. Wolfe excused himself to the plant rooms. I stayed behind, my plate half finished, staring at the spot where the wineglass caught the light. The charter's case would fade from the papers in a week. Elspeth might disappear into a quiet facility or a back-page plea deal. Franklin would lawyer his way into probation and a tarnished reputation. And Joanna would keep her memories to herself in an apartment filled with silenced photographs. But Mikey would remain. Not as a headline, not as a file, but as a faint trace in our minds, a child who lined up strawberries because odd numbers made sense to him, because routine meant safety, and because no one ever taught him what to do when those routines failed. Back in the office, I sat at my desk and opened my notebook. I didn't write a report, not the official kind. I wrote his name. Michael Aaron Whitt. And beneath it, loved strawberries, liked odd numbers, trusted too easily. I closed the notebook, and I let the silence have the last word. The brownstone settled into its old rhythm like a pond reclaiming stillness after someone had thrown a stone through the surface. No more visitors, no more phones ringing before lunch, and no more knives arriving in linen napkins. Wolfe resumed his rituals, beer at 6, orchids at dawn, and food prepared to the standard of a French tribunal. To the outside world, the charter's case had folded itself into the same category as a summer storm. Sudden, regrettable, and best forgotten. But neither of us forgot. And if Wolfe had put the boy's name away in some sealed drawer of his mind, I hadn't. There was one thing still circling the drain of my thoughts. It wasn't the bruises or the sedative or the strawberries. It was the silence that followed. Franklin's silence, Elspeth's silence, Joanna's late confession. They all told different stories, but none had explained why Mikey was never seen at school, not in photos, not in systems that should have tracked him. Wolfe hadn't asked. Maybe he thought it was outside the bounds of the case. But I wasn't so sure. So I dug. I started with the school district. No enrollment, then child welfare. No follow-ups filed after the guardianship transfer. The boy had vanished into a bureaucratic fog the moment Elspeth got custody. No paper trail, no services, no oversight. Which meant someone had helped her make that happen. And it hadn't been Joanna. She barely scraped by, working overnight shifts and borrowing rent. The only one with leverage, with access, with enough social grease to make a state agency go blind. Franklin Charters. That night, I waited until Wolfe was through with dinner and the orchids had been misted. Then I sat across from him in the office, notebook in hand. "You missed something," I said. He didn't look up. Unlikely. Franklin didn't just know about the boy. He buried him. Not literally, on paper. He kept him invisible. Wolfe's eyes flicked toward me. "He used connections at Hartley and Dawson," I said. "They've got in-house legal liaisons with the state's family courts, quiet favors, private pushes. It wouldn't be hard to make Mikey disappear on the record, especially if the child was already a ward of the state." Wolfe sighed. A favor disguised as benevolence. "And all it took was one clerk, one unsigned paper, one missing school record. That," he murmured, "is worse than murder. It's erasure." He pressed his fingers together beneath his chin and stared at the window. "And no law covers it." "No," I said. "But it explains why Elspeth felt untouchable, why Franklin thought he could play God with sedatives. They'd built a world without witnesses." "And yet," Wolfe said, "we saw." We sat in silence. After a while, Wolfe said, "You intend to pursue this? Not for charges, not for press, just for documentation. Someone has to record it." He considered me for a long moment, then do so carefully. The next morning I visited Hartley and Dawson. I didn't bring a badge. I didn't bluff credentials. I brought charm and a pair of cufflinks Franklin once had monogrammed with the company logo. I flashed them at the front desk. Mr. Charters asked me to retrieve a file he forgot. It's under the Charters guardianship memo, internal archive. Legal admin, not client-facing. The receptionist blinked, paused, and then, miraculously, pointed me down a hallway. Inside the records room, a woman with a name tag and a bun so tight it looked cranial handed me a thin brown folder without comment. I didn't open it until I was back in the cab. Inside, a single page. Notarized, unsigned, typed in Franklin's usual clipped tone. "To whom it may concern, Michael Aaron Witt is under the care of Elspeth Charters. Please redirect all welfare inquiries to our firm's liaison office. All further correspondence will be filtered through Ms. Charters' legal advocate." There was no legal advocate listed, no caseworker name, just the stamp of Hartley and Dawson and a signature line that had been left blank. By design, it wasn't a document, it was a smokescreen. That night I placed it on Wolfe's desk. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, finally, he said, "We are not arbiters, Archie." "No," I replied. "But we still keep records." He tapped the folder once with the back of his hand. That boy was born without leverage, and they used that fact like a lever against him. They did. Wolfe closed his eyes. "They made a child into a liability," he said. "No," I said. "They made him into an inconvenience." The next day I called Joanna. I didn't tell Wolfe. I asked her to meet me at Riverside Park near the playground. When she arrived, she carried a small paper bag. Inside were 3 strawberries. Fresh, ripe, uncut. "He always insisted on odd numbers," she said. I took one and placed it on the bench, then another, then the third. We sat in silence for a while. Then I said, "His name is written down. It's in Wolfe's files, in mine." She nodded. "That's enough." It wasn't, but it was something. As we stood to leave, I looked back at the bench. 3 strawberries, lined up, like memory. Perfect, odd, unspoken. Later, back at the brownstone, I returned to the office. Wolfe was in his chair. The air smelled faintly of citrus and dust. "I filed the memo," I said. He nodded. "I listed Franklin's role. Quietly, no embellishment, just the facts." "Very good." I included the strawberries. "Good." Then after a moment he said, "It won't bring the boy back." "No," I said. but it might keep someone else from vanishing. That night, as I turned off the desk lamp, I glanced at the edge of Wolfe's blotter. A small line of paper rested there, folded once. It wasn't in Wolfe's handwriting. It was mine. I had written Mikey's name again. No dates, no summary, just his name. As I reached for it, Wolfe said from the shadows, "Leave it." I did, and we let the dark settle in around it like it belonged. The following morning broke with a strange clarity, a thin autumn sun slicing through the front windows of the brownstone and landing across Wolfe's desk like a quiet intrusion. I sat with my coffee, no paper in hand. I'd already read it twice. There was no mention of Mikey, no retractions, no new headlines. Just real estate trends and a food column praising a beet tart as if it had solved diplomacy. The city had moved on, but Wolfe hadn't. He sat in his chair, untouched beer at his elbow, his gaze fixed not on the orchids or the walls or even me, but the strip of folded paper still sitting at the edge of the blotter, the one with Mikey's name. He hadn't moved it. I hadn't either. It sat there like a gravestone without a cemetery. "I've received a letter," Wolfe said finally, his voice brittle as morning frost, "from Franklin Charter's lawyer." That earned my full attention. I set the coffee down and leaned in. "Let me guess," I said. "A cease and desist?" "Hardly. An appeal to your better nature, to my discretion. The family intends to pursue privacy. Franklin's assets are being restructured. There are talks of a voluntary resignation from Hartley and Dawson. Elspeth will not contest custody motions or request visitation rights to any minors, should she ever qualify again." I leaned back. "Sounds tidy." "It is not," Wolfe said. "It is strategy. They are constructing a narrative. Tragedy shaded by mental instability. An accidental overdose framed as a regrettable attempt at emotional restoration. They're rewriting the ending." "Yes. And they want your silence to smooth it over." He nodded. I exhaled. "What did you say?" I said nothing. Yet. That wasn't like Wolfe. He was many things. Vain, stubborn, obsessed with order, but rarely undecided. This was different. "You're considering it," I said. He didn't reply. I looked at the paper again. The folded name. "You don't think it matters?" I asked. "Whether his name is spoken again?" "Of course it matters," he said. "But whose purpose does it serve?" I stood. "The truth's." Wolfe turned his eyes to me. There was weariness in them, not fatigue, just the weight of knowing too many endings. "I am not the court," he said, "and I'm not the press." "No," I replied, "but you're the only one who saw it all and didn't look away." The bell rang. Fritz answered. A moment later, he stepped into the office. "There is a visitor. Miss Joanna Miles." Wolfe closed his eyes. "Let her in." She entered with her coat clutched to her chest and a thin envelope in hand. There were dark crescents under her eyes, but her voice, when she spoke, was calm. "I wanted to give you something," she said, placing the envelope on Wolfe's desk. He didn't reach for it. "What is it?" "His drawing, one of the few I kept." That made me blink. She nodded. "He made it one afternoon while I was watching him. Elspeth was out. He found a red crayon and folded a piece of paper in half, then drew 3 strawberries. Just 3, one on each half, one in the corner. Odd numbers." She took a breath. "He said it was so they don't feel alone." I looked at Wolfe. He hadn't moved. "May I see it?" I asked. Joanna handed it to me. I unfolded it. It was crude, sure, scribbled lines, lopsided circles. But it was unmistakable. 3 strawberries arranged like anchors across a child's uncertain universe. Beneath them, in crooked letters, "Mikey's fruit." I passed it to Wolfe. He didn't flinch. Joanna stood there, uncertain. I know this doesn't fix anything, she said. No, Wolfe said, but it names something. She nodded once. Then quietly, will you keep it? Wolfe looked at her, and for a long moment I thought he might refuse. But then he reached out, took the paper, and laid it gently beside the folded name. I will. Joanna gave a soft thank you and left. The door closed behind her like the exhale of a long breath. Wolfe didn't speak for a while. The drawing stayed there on the desk. It looked absurd and beautiful against the clean leather of his blotter. You're not going to give them what they want, are you? I asked finally. No, Wolfe said, not because of pride, not even because of principle. Then why? Because no amount of silence can erase that drawing. He stood slowly and walked to the filing cabinet near the corner of the room. He opened the second drawer, rare for him, and pulled out a manila folder. Then, carefully, he placed both the drawing and the folded slip with Mikey's name inside. He closed it and slid it into place. That is not justice, he said, but it is a record. The drawer clicked shut. We didn't say anything else for a while. Later that evening, when the sun dipped below the city and the brownstone took on its soft amber glow, I sat alone at my desk and wrote one more line in my notebook. He didn't forget him. Not the court, not the firm, not even the world. Just Wolfe. Just us. And that, I thought, might be the closest we ever got to justice for a boy who liked strawberries in odd numbers and believed, if only for a little while, that someone was listening. The next morning arrived with the kind of quiet that only follows something permanent. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask questions because it already knows the answers, and they're heavier than anything you could carry. Wolfe sat in his chair, motionless, a half-finished glass of beer sweating into a linen coaster. The boy's drawing, 3 strawberries in a red crayon galaxy, was pinned beside his desk blotter, not filed away. Wolfe didn't comment on it, and I didn't ask. The folder with Mikey's name still sat beneath it, unlabeled, untitled, just there, like a final chapter written in invisible ink. There were no more visitors. The Charters family had slipped into legal purgatory, Elspeth under voluntary psychiatric evaluation, Franklin quietly ousted from the firm, and no press chasing them because there was no trial. Joanna disappeared into her quiet life with a night shift and one framed drawing hung above her desk. Kramer had moved on to a triple homicide in the Bronx, and I'd already received a case offer involving a missing parrot and a fur coat, which I tactfully refused. But one loose thread still dangled, and Wolfe didn't like loose threads. It came, finally, not from the law, or the press, or the parties involved, but from the post. A small box, plain brown wrapping, no return address. Fritz opened it and brought it in like it was ticking. Wolfe eyed it, peeled it open, and pulled out a small cloth pouch. Inside were 3 glass marbles, red, green, blue, and a short note. For Mikey, odd numbers, always. No signature. Wolfe passed the marbles to me. They caught the sunlight just right. I recognized Joanna's handwriting. I placed them in a dish on my desk. Later that evening, Wolfe and I sat in silence as Fritz brought dinner. A braised lamb with rosemary, perfectly tender. Wolfe took 2 bites, then set down his fork. "You see, Archie," he said finally, "justice is not a verdict." "No? Number justice is an interruption." I frowned. "You'll have to explain that one." Wolfe leaned back and folded his hands across his stomach. The world operates on repetition, habits, power. People like Franklin build routines that serve them. People like Elspeth build stories that protect them. People like Mrs. Hatley survive through silence. When a child enters that pattern and does not conform, they attempt to mold him or erase him. And justice? Justice is the disruption of that pattern. It does not restore what was lost. It simply stops it from continuing. I nodded slowly. So we didn't fix it. Number, but we interrupted it. He reached for his beer, held it, then paused. That is the most anyone can do. After dinner, Wolfe returned to the plant room and I went to the office. I opened my drawer, pulled out my notes, and wrote the final entry. Michael Aaron Witt, age 7, died believing he was still loved. That's all the story anyone needs. I signed my initials and closed the file. Outside, the street was quiet, yellow street lamps haloing the pavement. No sirens, no drama, just the slow breath of a city too big to care unless someone makes it. We had made it. Not loudly, not perfectly, but enough. I turned out the light, paused by the drawing and straightened it gently. Then I said what Wolfe never would. Good night, kid. And let the darkness settle back in, peaceful this time, because the truth had been spoken, and for once it had stayed in the room.